Again, welcome back for the final segment of Apidays Helsinki North 2022. And I have the pleasure of welcoming Liam from across the lake or next door Stockholm here. And you're going to explain the very, very tricky question of should we have webhooks or REST APIs? And you're saying we should actually have both. Isn't that right?
That's right, Marika. Yeah. So that's Looking
that's basically the question, and you have some answers. So go ahead. You have slides up.
Great. Thank you. And it's great to be speaking here at API Days. So today I'm going to talk about why I believe webhook APIs are going to become a lot more prominent than in the past, and how they complement REST APIs. Or in other words, why webhook APIs are REST APIs' perfect sidekick. But let me first introduce myself. My name is Liam Forde. I'm most recently a co-founder of Hookie, an open source webhook API platform. Prior to that, I've spent a significant portion of my career integrating systems and businesses, working with many integration products, and more recently, API products. And lastly, I'm also a father with two beautiful daughters who I've got to spend a lot more time with thanks to the pandemic. And they've got to know a lot more about the work I do. And my 9-year-old is probably one of the few 9-year-olds that knows what a REST API is and what a webhook API is. And she was desperate to help me with this presentation. So she drew me a couple of superheroes, the REST API superhero and the webhook API superhero. See if you can spot them in the slides. So let me start my presentation by first acknowledging what REST APIs have done to improve our lives, our digital lives, that is. And before REST APIs, it wasn't pretty. Data was locked behind proprietary protocols and ugly user interfaces that didn't understand what UX was short for, let alone how to provide a good one. Applications were packaged with UI and backend together. And if you were lucky, you got some file export capability. But REST APIs changed all that. Thanks to REST APIs, data was unlocked. Developers and product owners could start creating user experiences for specific user groups, enabling digitalization to become a buzzword and users to get experiences that met their needs and expectations. Swagger and then the Open Api Specification provided the foundation for the number of supporting tools that enabled companies to adopt APIs at scale. One of the most important supporting tools was the developer portal, where developers could quickly and easily find out what APIs existed and could request access. This removed a significant barrier for the developers and enabled them to deliver more at a faster speed. But even more important than that, it enabled them to innovate. This gave companies the agility with the ability to adapt to change much faster than before. And like that, REST APIs have become a mandatory part of a product, and the majority of enterprises have become aware that they are fundamental to their strategies. According to Postman's State of the API report, 93% of developers use REST APIs, and a whopping 53% of those developers not only use them, but love them too. REST APIs have been so successful, you could say that they were synonymous with integration. And for those integration developers and architects like myself, we have gravitated towards APIs to help solve the integration challenge. But is it true? Is a REST API all we need to integrate systems into an existing IT landscape? Well, when I refer to integration, I'm referring to system-to-system integration, or B2B integration, which is needed to synchronize data and automate processes. Data integration is critical to the operations of an organization. How quickly you can add new and adapt existing integrations is also a fundamental indicator as to how agile a company is. But compared to where digitalization is with creating new apps and portals using REST APIs, the space of data integration is still very much in the pre-digitalization dark ages. To describe this environment, you would say it's event-driven messaging to automate processes and synchronize data. The events are running on an ESB or message broker, connecting systems using different protocols. Electronic data interchange, or EDI, is still dominant for B2B integration. What events run through these platforms can't be easily discovered. In fact, even finding out what data you have running through the platform, who is producing it, and who is consuming it is not easy to find. And there is definitely no self-service for developers. Instead, developers need to deal with centralized integration teams to get data. For this, you need to create a demand or start an integration project. And 2 to 6 months later, you have data flowing into your platform. It's definitely not what you would describe as agile. And in today's world, it is becoming unpalatable. And if you're a developer, architect, or product owner in a position where you need to get data from another system, you will look for any way around it. Don't they have an API? And the answer is becoming yes. They do have a REST API. And just because they exist, they are less friction, and you can get the integration done faster, they are being used. However, as we know, REST APIs are request-driven, meaning that if you want to synchronize updates from another system, you need to call the API on a loop, polling it regularly, 24/7, regardless of if there is any new updates or not. This is not only a waste, it also isn't great for the following reasons. It doesn't scale well. Each new API client has its own polling schedule, inundating your API with requests, each request querying your database, which adds unnecessary load. The performance of your system starts degrading, and costs go up as you have to scale your infrastructure. Because of this, you're encouraged not to call the API too regularly. Every minute is okay, every 5 minutes is okay, which leads to poor user experience across the organization. Maybe the data hasn't been synchronized yet. Let's give it a few minutes and try again. It's also not easy to track which system is getting what data. You know what API clients you have, but what data have they pulled out? It's not that easy to track, which has become more important with GDPR. So we need another solution. We want to use APIs with their simplicity, discoverability, and self-service, but a REST API is not the right fit. Well, as many of you know, they're not the only type of API out there. And with the rise of event-driven architecture, event-driven APIs are gaining more prominence. So let's talk about the most popular and prominent type of event-driven API, the webhook. And let me explain why webhook APIs have the ability to complement REST APIs, and why I believe you will start to see a lot more webhook APIs popping up beside their REST API counterpart. So the majority of us here, API fans as we all are, will be aware of webhooks. According to Postman's State of the API report, 51% of API developers have used webhooks. But for those that don't really know what a webhook is, let me introduce you to it. Like a REST API, they use JSON and HTTP, which is great, simple, understandable, and most importantly, accessible technologies. Unlike REST APIs, they are event-driven. When an event occurs in a source system, the source system pushes the data to the subscribers. That's great. We can avoid polling for updates. Sounds like we might have a fit to complement the REST API. Systems could make their data available as webhooks, allowing downstream systems to subscribe to the data. That does sound promising. But hang on, webhooks have been around for a while and have polarized developers. On one side, webhooks have been viewed as a nice, simple solution to event-driven integration. On the other side, problematic to manage due to many different levels of quality in individual implementations. Which is true, right? There are a lot of different webhook implementations out there today because essentially everyone is building their own capability. And to say it's a bit like the Wild West is not the worst metaphor. For where we are with webhooks today, with good implementations, bad implementations, ugly implementations, and implementations you just can't rely on. It's no wonder there exists this polarization with developers. However, like the majority of us, webhook implementations will mature, and for technologies to mature, they need good foundations. Swagger and then the Open API Specification was one of those foundational tools that, in my opinion, was a catalyst for widespread REST API adoption. It enabled companies to build other tools with a common ground of understanding how an API was specified. So for webhooks and event-driven APIs to scale and become as mainstream as REST APIs, we need that common ground. The Open API specification has provided some capability with callbacks. For those that haven't come across this part of the specification, you can specify callbacks against an endpoint. For example, you can have a subscriptions endpoint where you can create, delete, update, and manage your subscription. And under that endpoint, you can have all the different types of events under the callback tag that are possible to subscribe to. But only having the option to specify your events behind a single endpoint is a bit limiting for an event-driven API. Let me explain limiting. First, you don't want to build webhook capability in each and every system. You want to pull it out and reuse, which means you want to host several different webhook APIs in your API infrastructure. You also likely want to provide different authorization rules for discoverability of your webhooks. You don't want to advertise all your webhooks to all developers. Enterprises like a bit more control in this space. So having all your callbacks behind a single subscriptions endpoint in an Open API specification provides some challenges. Luckily, there is an alternative that is emerging that make event-driven APIs the hero, and I'm referring to the Async API specification. Started in 2015 as an open source project, now with 49 contributors and 2,000 stars in GitHub, and also some very heavy-hitting sponsors. The Async API specification is becoming the standard for event-driven APIs. Here we can define our APIs, group our webhooks within them, just like we define our REST APIs, and group endpoints within them. And this is where webhooks become webhook APIs and get the foundation that propelled REST APIs into mainstream. And to give you a quick overview of the Async API specification, the first thing you notice is that the Async API specification is very similar in structure to the Open API specification. The specification starts with the API introduction, the name, description, etc. Next comes the server information, again similar to Open API. However, it's in the next section, the heart of the specification, where things get the most different. Instead of paths, or what some of us call endpoints in Open API, with methods post, put, get, etc., you have channels, or what some of us might call topics. With each channel, you have the ability to specify a publish or subscribe verb. And after that, it gets similar again to Open API. You have components where you specify your schemas and security schemes. So with the Async API specification, we now have the foundation to start building some API tooling that make it easier for webhook APIs to become mainstream. And with the specification in place, the next foundation tool, we need to provide some capability within a developer portal to make your webhook APIs discoverable. There's obviously no point designing and providing great event-driven APIs if you don't let your developer community know about them. This is the first step in empowering your developers. To further empower your developers, you need to make those APIs self-service. And with a REST API, you generally go to a developer portal, discover the API, try it out, request access, access gets approved, you get the security keys, and you start calling the APIs. With webhook APIs, it starts the same. You want to discover the API, then you want to create a subscription, provide the callback details, etc. Try it out, request approval, get approved, and activate the subscription. This workflow might be a bit different to what you've seen before. Many webhook implementations only provide you with a subscribe or subscription endpoint, which is nice. Don't get me wrong, there should be a REST API to manage a subscription. However, in the majority of use cases, you don't need to write code to create a subscription to a webhook. We don't need to write code to request access to a REST API. Why would we need to write code to subscribe to a webhook? Secondly, what you don't often see in a webhook implementation is an approval step. Now, admittedly, it is not needed in all webhook use cases. However, for webhook implementation to gain widespread adoption, this will be a critical step. Data providers want to know where their data is being sent. Next up, to make webhook APIs more mainstream, is to have some tools that can be easily deployed into an architecture that deal with the engine of a webhook API service. Just like REST APIs needed API gateways to help enterprises and platforms manage the ingress, webhook APIs need a gateway to help manage the egress. And the primary job of this gateway will be to manage the guaranteed delivery to the subscribers. And what subscribers generally demand from a webhook service is that it will be resilient to intermittent outages, recover from downtimes, and be able to replay messages when required. This includes a bunch of requirements and concerns that need to be considered, including retry strategies. For example, how often and how long should retries occur to be resilient to those intermittent outages? Time to live. Is there a time limit when this message is relevant? If it's not delivered today, is there any point delivering it tomorrow? And FIFO, is the order of the delivery important? We also need those recovery strategies. So if my system was down for a while and I want to automatically recover any messages which stop retrying when I start up, what capabilities does my Webhook API service have? And resend functionality. Sometimes downstream systems need to have it sent again because of an issue they ran into on their side. And lastly, throttling. Different subscribers will have different capabilities, and this needs to be catered for. And also, if webhooks are going to become more mainstream in enterprise, well, then security will be a focus of the implementations. Most webhooks today use TLS and verify authorization to callbacks based on HMAC or API keys. However, enterprises will need and demand more security than that. First, you're going to need to ensure that only authorized developers can discover and request to subscribe to your webhooks. So single sign-on capability and authorization groups will be required. Next, as I referenced in making Webhook APIs self-service, enterprises will need to ensure that the data is being sent to an authorized location. That means we need to make sure that individual subscriptions get reviewed and approved before becoming activated. Third, we need to, of course, make sure that only encrypted connections are used and that we only use SSL certificates with trusted certificate authorities. Fifth, some use cases and enterprises will demand that client server is trusted through mutual TLS. And lastly, an enterprise will probably want to layer another security mechanism to verify authorization, such as using OAuth or some other technique. And if you're starting to think there's a lot more engineering involved to build a reliable enterprise-grade webhook service that meets subscribers' needs than you first thought, well, then I can only agree with you. There is a lot of engineering to build a webhook API platform to support an enterprise. But what cannot be denied is the usefulness and power of webhooks, with the simplicity of JSON and accessibility of HTTP. In fact, webhook usage is only on the rise, with many SaaS platforms using it as their choice of integration pattern for real-time events to customers. And I don't see this trend changing. And when implemented correctly, with enterprise-grade quality and features such as discoverability to see what webhook APIs exist, self-service to get access to those APIs, removing the bottlenecks of centralized integration teams, empowering developers with problems to solve, the access to the real-time data they need, and also providing control and visibility to your data providers over which systems can and is getting their data. The ability also to provide a more cost-effective and streamlined solution for your B2B partners, giving you the ability to stop with costly B2B EDI setups. It will ultimately result in companies being able to integrate new systems, tooling, partners, and even businesses at the speed that is now demanded in today's highly connected and competitive world, giving companies true agility with integration. And this is why product owners, integration architects, and developers are starting to think about adding event-driven APIs, like Webhook Apis, to their architectures. However, everyone building their own Webhook API capability does not make sense. What is required is some off-the-shelf components that anyone can quickly and easily add to their architecture. And that is the reason why we have started Webhookie, an open source Webhook API platform that can be quickly added to any product, platform, or integration architecture. Come and join the project. Thank you. Sorry, I can't hear you, Mariuka. I think you're muted.
Sorry, muted. First video lags and then muting. Okay. Yes. Yeah. So interesting to see that you're we're evolving from REST API portals to GraphQL portals to event portals to webhook portals, and I think that this is something that people have been waiting for, even if they haven't really known that they are waiting for it. But Alan is asking that what has been the biggest barrier to using webhooks to date? How is that changing?
Well, I think the biggest barrier is the common set of tooling that is out there that you take for granted in the REST API world. I mean, we take for granted, the Open Api specifications and the developer portals that support those specifications that enable you to request access and get access. I mean, yeah. I think in today's world, webhook APIs or webhooks have been behind the scenes like a second-class citizen that don't get that prominence or that easy developer experience to subscribe to them. So that's one of the things that I see holding webhooks back, is that no common tooling and no common architecture for that for webhooks.
So. From that point, I think that REST hooks emerged originally by Zapier, and they were kind of the de facto thing for a while, and REST hooks are lending themselves quite nicely to even be described with Open API. So do you see like REST hooks being a thing, or?
Well, I see REST hooks, to me, REST hooks are webhooks today. I mean, if you don't have a subscription endpoint where you can manage that subscription via a REST API, which is a REST hook, then it's not, to me, a modern webhook solution. But still, I think that's REST hooks are just the first step. I mean, do you REST hooks imply that you have to write code to subscribe to an API? Really? I mean, it implies that you have to call an API to subscribe. How often do you subscribe to a webhook if you're setting up an integration? Generally, it's once. Why should you go and write some code to subscribe to a webhook when you can, it should be just a developer experience to do that. And secondly, like REST hooks don't enable you to have that separation of different webhook APIs if you want to have a platform. So if all your events are going to be behind one REST hook that can be subscribed to, and you give a developer access to that REST hook to subscribe, then essentially getting access to subscribe to all events possible on that behind that REST hook. And if you're talking,
and people, people don't necessarily think about that even when designing REST APIs, let alone REST hooks, and they maybe miss the authentication and the separation of concerns. So I think there might be room for many ways to deal with it, but definitely you need to separate what you are going to allow people to do with different hooks. That's an important point. And with that, thank you, Liam, so much for coming. I think we all needed to hear this.